What's that? Oh, we've just been wasting all this gold, basically.
In the green room
I
before
know.
the recording starts, we were chef's kiss of content and discussion, and now I've got nothing left.
Well, it's easy to stand on a soapbox and tell the world what's going wrong. But in court or the street in this miserable heat, we need more than just catchy songs. I want to inspire, not preach to the choir, shouting the slogans righteous and solemn, reading the books and joining the column, aware of our troubles but not how to solve them. And sometimes I feel like I'm part of the problem, like I'm part of the problem.
Well, I
Yeah.
was going to say 3.5 years into the war, it's naturally going to take play a smaller part in the national psyche, but and consciousness. But actually, Trump's really put that back on the agenda by having the Alaska summit, and then the subsequent White House meeting with Zelensky and all the European leaders. So much to say about all that, but there's the idea that is this just part of the distraction away from the Epstein scandal, which you could actually understand an awful lot of what Trump does in that way if you want, and I think that's fairly justified. So it's kind of back on the agenda, but I don't think too much is going to happen about it. But it's right, the more like Canada has a really big diaspora Ukrainian community there, and so it's more important. In fact, you've got politicians who are of Ukrainian descent. You do in America, you've got Vindman and Sparks, Victoria Sparks, but she's crazy nut job, MAGA. So like I think there's certain countries that have obviously greater connections to Ukraine. It's going to be in the consciousness more, but I think it should be something that the US is much more involved in, but it's just become a partisan issue. It's like Biden was big on supporting Ukraine, so kind of we won't be, but I think there's an awful lot to do with the Heritage Foundation.
Mhm.
So let me play devil's advocate for a minute. And I was thinking to myself before coming on, it's like, how can I trigger Jonathan? How can I trigger argument
Very
here
easily.
today? And it's like, there is a case, maybe a poor one, but there is a case to be made that Trump is playing multi-dimensional chess here, that he is giving Putin many ways out to save face, rolling out the red carpet, crapping on Zelensky, um, while at the same time ratcheting up pressure in terms of the fossil fuel industry, America or the United States or the states just producing more and more fossil fuels, driving the price of oil down. Oh, what do you say about that, Jonathan?
Oh goodness, where do we start here? So Trump is definitely not playing multi-dimensional chess here. And I'm glad that you brought this up because this is what I wanted to talk about today is going back to who Trump is, to understanding him by doing armchair psychology and understanding him and what drives him, and then understanding how he sees the world and how he understands global geopolitics and relationships between countries. So fundamentally, Trump and although I don't like Trump and it's easy for me to hate on Trump, I actually want to be fairly matter of fact in this. So when I say Trump is deeply, deeply ignorant, what I mean is like that in a technical sense. Like, so Trump is somewhat vacuous and he's ideologically vacuous and he doesn't have a great deal of knowledge about anything that he needs to know about given that he's the president of the United States, right? So the ideology is filled up by the people around him. Now, in the Trump 1.0, he had some sensible Republicans there because he kind of accidentally became president, and then he had to co-opt the establishment to support him in the presidency. And so the Trump administration 1.0 was kind of Vince Priebus and certain people who were fairly standard. Rex Tillerson, even those kind of people. Don't like them, but much more prepared this time, like Steve Bannon-esque sort of approach, but then using kind of Steve Bannon tactics and a Heritage Foundation writing the Project 2025 900-page document. That's a blueprint, and they literally are just doing that all. They are page by page going through that, and he is just a vehicle by which these other people, Steve Miller, Russell Vought, you name them, all these people are delivering their kind of idea of just heaven, like through Trump. And Trump just doesn't know enough about anything to really know what's going on. And so I'm going to do a lot of talking here. Sorry. So Trump is doesn't really know what's going on in the White House, and it's really important to know this. So there are loads of examples of this. The press keep asking him questions, and he keeps saying, "Oh, I don't know about that," or "Where did you hear about that?" And he says, "Well, from here and there." And they're like, "These are press people reporting stuff that you should know about and asking you a question on something you should know about, and you don't know about it, and you're admitting you don't know about it. What's going on there?" So we know that he's not receiving intelligence briefings. So at the same time that Biden received 90, he had received 14. He's receiving something like one every 2 weeks. He should be receiving them every day. He doesn't read, which means that where is he getting his information from? How does he learn about anything in the world? It's just being delivered to him by the people who actually have the ideology that then feed him curated bits of information that are just enough for him to get by. But if you listen to any speech that Trump has ever given in his life, give me one example where he's spoken in granular detail about anything, and he literally hasn't. So everything is in vague terms. So honestly, like anyone that listens to this video, watches this video, just think about this. Just listen to Trump's next 10 speeches, and then wonder whether he is delivering any kind of granular, detailed information about anything. Like, does he exhibit any kind of deep-rooted knowledge about anything he talks about? And he never does. So he doesn't really know about anything. And when it comes to Ukraine, like the stuff he says about Ukraine is routinely wrong. He talks about all the cities being rubblized and these spires, beautiful spires, thousands of years old. And you're like, well, everything he says about Ukraine is generally wrong or distorted. And the problem with his tenure 2.0 is somewhat like 1.0, but 2.0, there's no one around him that wants to correct him. So he's saying that prescription drug prices are going to come down by 1,500%, 1,200%, 900%. It's like, that's mathematically stupid. You're going to be paying people. You can't reduce the prices more than 100%. Otherwise, you're paying people to take drugs. But he said that something like 15 times, right? Which means that no one is correcting him on that. And they must know that it's wrong. So people are either afraid to correct him, or it's just, it doesn't matter anymore. Truth and facts don't matter. He's delivering what we want him to deliver. He's signing the executive orders. He's putting the policies in place. We've got this emergency economic situation, whatever emergency invasion of Venezuelan situation, so he can put things unilaterally, tariffs on unilaterally, do all these things. And this is brilliant. And this is everything that we want. And no one corrects him. He has no fundamental knowledge. And that makes him incredibly, incredibly dangerous and manipulatable, not only by people like Putin and people, these authoritarians he looks up to because they have power, but he's manipulatable by the people around him. And I think that's an incredibly dangerous situation to be in.
Yeah. So I think what I've been watching that I thought was just a stunning example of how far he's willing to go to distract from other things was they made this whole big deal the other day about how he was going to do a televised address from the Oval. Did either of you see this?
No.
Which one are you talking about? Because there are so many of these. Was it the one with Infantino from FIFA? Or is it all these different examples that are all horrendous?
Right. It was the FIFA, because this was the day after Flex's factory got bombed.
Yeah.
So here's this. I think it's a Houston-based company, right? Houston or Austin? It's Texas. So their company gets bombed by Putin after all this. Oh, everything's going to be great. I'm talking to everybody. Everything's going to be fine. We're going to work out. We're going to sit down. We're going to work it out. Boom, boom, boom. He just blew up an American factory. Great. And so they make this whole big thing about he's going to give a speech from the Oval, and it's, well, we're going to host the draw for FIFA at the Kennedy Center, and we're going to bring in this Chicago company that I'm working with to fix the Kennedy Center up first. And it's just, yeah, okay, Chicago Teamsters, Trump, and FIFA. There's no risk of corruption going on there.
This was a terrible, terrible press gaggle, as they always are. So people are thinking, to give you the context of what took place, people thinking, oh, Trump might be turning back to supporting Ukraine because he just released a Truth Social post that says Biden, because any opportunity to slag off Biden, it's like Biden stopped Ukraine from being able to strike deep into Russia with missiles and whatnot, ATACMS missiles and whatever. And that was like a great sports team only being able to play defense and not being able to play offense, blah, blah, blah. And he says, interesting times ahead. In other words, something funky is going on here, because he's saying, essentially, I'm going to allow Ukraine to hit deep into Russia, and that's going to be really good for Ukraine. Whoop-de-do. And then he comes on TV and with a picture of Putin and says, Putin's just sent me this picture, and he was like, rubbing it all over it. No, he wasn't. But it was just like, it was just horrible. And he was saying, Putin looks really good in this picture. And he's wearing like no tie, by the way, and a cap that says everything Trump said is right or whatever. It's like, you just slagged off Zelensky in February for not wearing a suit and tie and whatnot, and now you're wearing a cap and you're not wearing a tie, and that you look deeply unprofessional, and you're fawning over a murderous dictator. And then he's asked a question about Flex. So Flex is his company in the Zakarpattia region of Ukraine, which is really quite a safe area near the Hungarian border, and it's not an military industrial complex company. It is genuinely a commercial concern. In fact, the Russian propagandists, after its bomb, said we've hit Western investments. If it was a military industrial complex, so we've hit blah 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 blah. But no, they actually admit it was an investment. So this is a business entity being hit, and he's asked the question, how do you feel about that? He says, oh, it's bad. I've let them know it's bad, or something like that. And it's just like the weakest response to this. And you've got to remember as well that the Americans extorted, or tried to really badly extort, Ukraine with a minerals deal, this infamous minerals deal. And part of the reasoning for this was it was supposedly going to be a great security guarantee. Like, if we have American entities existing in Ukraine, then the Russians won't attack Ukraine, because otherwise they'd be in danger of taking out American entities. So this is actually, we don't need to put American troops in Ukraine. We just need a minerals deal. And then a couple of months, they signed this minerals deal. It actually ends up being better for Ukraine than it was initially. It was a horrendous deal, and they really were trying to extort Ukraine. Then a couple of months later, the Russians blow up an American factory. You're like, so tell us about this security guarantee that you were talking about before, and it's all absolutely horrendous. But I'm going to tie a few sort of things up here. So what you had Trump saying that he was going to allow Ukraine to fire missiles deep into Russia. And then you had a couple of days later, and there was a picture he released just after of him poking Putin in the chest, and then likened it, put the picture underneath of Nixon poking Khrushchev in the chest. So this was Trump flexing against Russia. Then it came out sometime later, NBC News reported that actually this was wrongly interpreted, and it should have been interpreted somehow that Ukraine are going to have to give up territory. I don't know how that works, but a White House official obviously didn't like and was trying to say that actually no, it's Ukraine are not as strong as Russia, and they're going to have to give up territory, and that was a bit weird. And then we heard that I forget who it was it Reuters? Anyway, someone reporting that Wall Street Journal reported that a guy called Elbridge Colby, who is like very high up in the Department of Defense underneath Pete Hegseth, and he was a guy responsible for pausing weapons shipments to Ukraine twice since the Trump administration started. That was highly controversial. And it looked like he had done that unilaterally without Trump say so. Then we've heard that they've been stopping Ukraine from using missiles and throwing missiles deep into Russia. ATACMS, American missiles, and UK produced Storm Shadows, but they require targeting data from the Americans. So the Americans get to say so whether they're used inside Russia, right? So Elbridge Colby has got a vetting process to stop missiles being sent in. But Trump's just announced that, hey, Biden stopped missiles being sent in, not me, thank you very much. And then Elbridge Colby's actually stopping them. And then we hear that and I think what Trump was doing, sorry, this is a really long explanation, but it really ties back to what I was saying about lack of knowing what's going on in the administration. So that Trump Truth Social post about a watch this space type thing, weapons deep into Russia. Then it comes out, again, it's Wall Street Journal, I think, announced that he's just signed off an FMS deal. So FMS is a foreign military sale of 3,350 ERAM missiles. These are missiles that the Americans have made precisely for Ukraine. So these didn't exist. They've made them for Ukraine, and they have something like a 461-kilometer range. So these are missiles that you can send from planes deep into Russia. And Trump has just sold a bunch of these. So I think he's signed the FMS deal. Then he wrote that Truth Social post to say, watch this space type thing, because then you're going to get American missiles being sent to Ukraine that they can use. At the same time, Elbridge Colby has got a veto on missiles being used deep into Russia. So we go back to Trump doesn't have a clue what's going on in his administration. And he has Heritage Foundation people like Elbridge Colby, who are unilaterally making decisions on US foreign policy and military policy. And Trump, and this is what happened with what's stopping the weapons. Apparently, Pete Hegseth didn't know about this. So Elbridge Colby's doing things that Pete Hegseth, who is in charge of the DoD, I mean, that's a joke, doesn't know about. So you've got Heritage Foundation doing stuff that Fox News anchor doesn't know about, is in charge of the DoD, 3 million people, $1 trillion worth of budget. And the president doesn't have a clue of any of this, about any of this. So the president's just doing things because he likes to be the center of attention. He likes to think he's on The Apprentice still. He likes these big dictators around the world because they get to hire and fire people. He can now do that. There was a book released about Trump that said that he was more proud about being on The Apprentice than he was being president in Trump 1.0. But in Trump 2.0, he's more like the Apprentice boss than he was in 1.0, because he doesn't have anyone around him that will veto what he does and says. And no one's correcting him. So he's more like that guy that can hire and fire, does what he wants, but he also doesn't have any research. He's not doing any research. So he's signing things, saying things, and then people under him are just deciding completely different things. And it's absolute chaos. Sorry, long answer.
That's okay, Jonathan. So what do you think Putin's goal is, besides grabbing as much of Ukraine as possible? Is it to get the fortress belt? Is that it? And then once he gets there, he can pause for a time being before he pivots to to invade another country or to destabilize another country?
This is such a hard question to answer, because Putin, and I said this to you on the last interview, I think Putin started off invading with it not being a war. So he literally did think it's a special military operation. Go in, change over government in 3 days, and then bish bash bosh, 15 days clearing it up. We've got our Rosgvardia, our kind of riot police sorting it all out. Then it turns out the Ukrainians who knew resisted, and then it's like, oh shit, they didn't welcome us with open arms. So then it became a war, and then it became a case of, well, we now have to change our objectives, because we were going to basically be controlling the entire country through a puppet government. And now that's not going to happen. So the next objective became to try and take Kyiv militarily. And then that failed. So then the objective, and I remember writing for Only Sky, wrote an article like literally weeks into the war saying, well, he's failed. Like, Putin can't win this war, as in he can't obtain what his initial objectives were. So what is his plan? And actually, I'm still at that, like 3.5 years later, we're still, well, what is his plan? So it was like, take here, no, couldn't do that. Take here, take all of Donbass, no, and everything started moving back and back and back. Take that land bridge down to Odessa. They can't do that now. They don't have the forces to be able to do that. But if I was a Russian general, I'd be right. We really should be taking the land bridge down to Odessa so that Ukraine doesn't have any coastal access and doesn't have any export ports, and then try and take all of Donbass, where you've got your rare earth metals, and that should be what an imperialist nation would want to do. But they don't have the troops or the material to do that. I could bore you with like stats on tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, and what we're not seeing operate on the front lines at the moment, and what we're not seeing Russia being able to build. They were refurbishing deep storage stocks, and now they've kind of run out of them, and they don't have the ability to build enough infantry fighting vehicles and tanks. So you're starting to see them use motorbikes, quads, golf buggies, well, what we call golf buggies, kind of like these buggies that look like golf buggies. They're kind of quasi military golf buggies, and larders and SUVs, and they're using them for logistics and then for attack, and they're attacking a lot on foot, and you're not seeing traditional combat assets. So you're saying, okay, so if that's your military situation, where you're basically taking land by grinding it away, losing incredible amounts of people, knowing that the Ukrainians have fewer people, so they're substituting people for drones. So the Ukrainians are defending by using both aerial drones, and now they're starting to use ground drones, what you called UGVs, unmanned ground vehicles, because they don't have enough people. So they try and make drone corridors to then stop the Russians from moving. But if you can break through those drone corridors, then you can do that with very few people if you can move quickly. What it means is that there's a lot of war going on with actually not a lot of people. The Russians are spread thin, the Ukrainians are spread thin. The Russians have got more people though, so they can just keep grinding on. But I think right now the momentum is slightly shifting. The Russians are in a bit of trouble. Looks like they're culminated. So to answer the question, what is Putin's goal now? I don't know, because if I was Putin, like, if the question is how much does he know about what's going on, like in granular detail, and like he can't get across the Dnieper River to take Odessa and Mykolaiv. He can't really take all of Donbass unless the Americans force Ukraine to give it up. And so my idea is that Putin's objective is to manipulate through reflexive control Donald Trump.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, what are the prisoner of war numbers on either side? Do you know those? Because it seems like what you're describing as the Russian play, like if a small team manages to advance through whatever drone corridor and take but it'd be really easy for them to get boxed off, and then just because then they'd be surrounded once the drone corridor starts up again if they get past it, right?
So this has just happened in a place called Dobropilia near Pokrovsk, right? It's all about Pokrovsk, this poor city that's getting encroached upon very close on three sides, basically the Russians. And they broke through all the way with these deep reconnaissance groups on foot mainly, because the Ukrainian defenses were so lightly manned. And they actually got through to this is an area where the Ukrainians have built a load of trench lines, like big anti-tank ditches and all sorts, in the eventuality that this would happen. And then the Russians suddenly broke through. And so what the Russians would have been trying to do was, once you break through like that, then you would send in what called exploitation troops. So you'll send in your mechanized equipment and other stuff, and then you start bringing in artillery, and then you kind of widen what you've taken, and then you establish yourself there. And then the Ukrainians realized that this was not quite a breakthrough, but it was a deep reconnaissance breakthrough. And there are these people that were in places they really shouldn't have been, a long way, like 17 kilometers back from where the front line was. So this was a real problem. And the Ukrainians sent in a load of their top units, the Azov National Guard, and then they've stopped it, and they did encircle a bunch of troops, and they've absolutely shellacked a bunch of Russians and taken a bunch of prisoners. And I think they're trying to then continue that momentum and push back in other places, but the frailties there. So the Russians can do that in a number of places, and this is one of their strategies earlier on in the war. It's called deep battle doctrine, where they kind of are pressing everywhere, and wherever they find a weakness, then they just pile in there. So it's not like, right, we're going to attack here and we're going to attack there. It's kind of like attack everywhere, and then wherever it's weakest, you pile in. And so there's still an element of that, which is, kind of attacking all over the shop, and then waiting for a little breakthrough and then piling in. But luckily the Ukrainians were able to sort them out there. The question is, so for me, if I was to sum up the war in Ukraine right now, it's a game of attritional chicken. So like who kind of trick the other side with the ratio that's most beneficial to them in terms of both material and personnel. And if the Ukrainians can do that to the Russians by doing active defense mainly, then they will sit on defense to trick the Russians. But at some point, they do need the momentum to take back some stuff. But so far, the Russians have been, I think, exhausting themselves materially and in personnel. And Ukraine are winning that game of attritional chicken, but they're both going down. But the thing is, Ukraine has far fewer people to draw from, especially since 10 million Ukrainians have left the country to go elsewhere. So it's a game of attritional chicken.
I was reading, I think it was in The Economist, about Ukrainian women serving and the pushback against Ukrainian women serving in the armed forces. Not, and sometimes at the front line too. And I know we talked about this last time too, about the draft age in Ukraine being high.
Demographic black hole at the age that they need to draft people. But yeah, carry on.
So can you talk about that, about the black hole and about the decision tree that makes them, what's the age? 25, 26?
So it used to be 27. They moved it down to 25, but they're basically protecting 18 to 25-year-olds. And most people, not most, I fully understand the dilemma here. So you're at war, you need people. You absolutely, some analysts would say, absolutely need to be force mobilizing 18 to 25-year-olds. Why the frick are you not doing that? You're at war, right? And these are your youngest, like fittest troops and blah, blah, blah. But the problem is, if you look at a graph of the men and women and each sort of age cohort, it goes, it's obviously not very many at the top, but then goes out in the kind of 40s and 50s, and then when it comes down to the age that you want, 18 to 25, it goes right down like this. And then you also have the highest mortality rate in the world and the lowest birth rate in the world, all close to Ukraine. So they're not having children because men are at war, blah blah blah, and it's wartime, and it's not the kind of time that people think of having kids. But they need children to replace the huge mortality rates they've got, and they need to mobilize people. But the very cohorts they need to mobilize people, they've got the fewest number of people there, plus a lot of people have left the country. So if you were to do a forced mobilization of those age groups, you would destroy the economy. And if you don't have an economy, what are you fighting for? Do you know what I mean? So it's a real dilemma. So and I do understand why Zelensky hasn't done this, although loads of people have said he absolutely should have done this already. Why has he not done this? What an idiot. But he's, you allow people to stay at university or have a trade or whatever, learn there, so that you still have a skilled society after the war. Otherwise, if you send 18-year-olds off to battle, then all they know is war. So 18 to 25-year-olds, they are also the people that are most likely to have children. So you want them to be banging out the kids, adding to the economy, getting skilled, and then when they hit 25, then you're going to go off to war. You take all those people, then you destroy all those other things, and it's just a dilemma. You're damned if you do, damned if you don't. So what he's been trying to do is things like, right, we'll put you through university, but you can voluntarily, between 18 and 25, you can voluntarily join the army. So we're not going to force mobilize you, but then we'll give you loads of perks for doing so. So he's really trying to, like, the carrot rather than the stick. But they also need foreign fighters, because Russia's just been hoovering up foreign fighters from around the world, because you give an attractive wage, like you've got an entire world's population to draft people from, and you're going to get people from Africa, people from all over the shop, India, Sri Lanka, Cape Verde Islands, Cuba. So the Ukrainians need to do that.
The Europeans have more money than the Russians, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's pretty clear in terms of the economy. Why don't the Europeans just like throw a bunch of money on the table and get more mercenaries? Then, if the question is, let's hoover up mercenaries from around the world and do some kind of like Ukrainian Foreign Legion. Why is that happening? I don't know.
Well, it is happening to an extent. So the Ukrainians just announced the other day that they were going to create some new assault units that they are aiming by fairly soon to get 7,000 a month. It's going to be made up of 3,500 mobilized Ukrainians, 2,500 I can't remember where it's from, maybe convicts or something, and 1,000 foreigners. And I thought that's really interesting that you've actually factored in getting 1,000 foreigners from Ukraine, because Russia there's this asymmetry where they've had this advantage where they were getting convicts. The Ukrainians did that then themselves, which is very good. They needed to do that. There are many benefits for doing that, but the Russians did it in a much more horrible way because they don't really care about their people. The Ukrainians care about their people, and that is genuinely a difference there. Um, but so the Ukrainians need to do the convict things. Okay, they're doing that, and they need the foreign fighters. The problem with foreign fighters, though, is that if they get captured, then they may have a higher like value. Because other nations would be then fighting to get their POWs back. So, for example, if you had 5 British soldiers captured, then the Russians would be like, "Oh, this is worth a lot." Whereas 5 Ukrainians, they're like, "Well, I don't care if they die in prison, blah blah blah." Five British, then they can use that as leverage over the British. So there are advantages, I'd say, for getting foreign fighters because you don't have the people yourself, but some caveats. But going back to the women on the front line, so yeah, so I suggested right from the beginning of the war, and it's really funny because I'm no expert, right? I'm also autodidact in these matters, and you end up doing all this research, and you just use your logic and just go, well, if I was in government, I'd probably do this and I'd probably do that, and then it turns out like 7 months later, the Ukrainians are doing that. And it's like, I bloody said that, and you give yourself a pat on the back, but it's like quite weird as like just some random YouTuber, you come up with all these ideas and they end up being reality down the line. But I was saying, look, right at the beginning, was saying you need to get the women in to do jobs like, or older people or infirm people, even like certain jobs, like if you're anti-aircraft mobile crew, so you've got a big anti-aircraft kind of big machine gun on the back of a SUV. Really, a lot of these ones are. It's like, well, that's just someone driving an SUV. Like, you don't need to be a fit young man to drive an SUV. Like, most people can drive an SUV. You drive that around, you go to where you know the Shahed drone is, and then someone on the back's just firing at that. And then, like, so the skills you need to be able to do that are actually quite narrow. And most people can, like, probably do all of those different components doing that, including women. So you are seeing female only like air defense mobile teams, and that's exactly what I was suggesting right at the beginning. And it's taken time, but these things are happening because needs must. Necessity is a mother of all invention, and so you need women to be able to do that. If you've got an amputee that can still use their foot with a blade or something, you can be in the back of an SUV with a big machine gun firing it in the air, I'm sure, still. So there are roles. There needs to be really creative with getting border patrol people and customs and police, right? They can be filled by other older people or women or whatever, and then let's move those young men from the border and from the police into units on the front line, which is something they have been sort of playing around with as well.
Well, there's definitely something to be said for how you define a frontline position, right? Like, since so much of it is information control and information warfare, like in World War II, there was Bletchley Park where they were trying to crack Enigma, and yeah, that was all staffed by women, right? A lot of that code breaking was women.
Yeah, and there are loads of roles, and I'm sure they're doing this, and I know this, and all the HR departments and this and that. I would be getting in your veterans and your wounded and whatever, and putting them in all these positions and clearing out the fit and able. But what you also want to do is you want to communicate to your people that actually you are going to be posted to the front line, you're going to be looked after, you're going to get the requisite training, you're going to get the requisite ammunition, and people want, there's this idea, well, I don't want to be sent to that unit because that unit's not got very good reputation. I want to be sent to this unit. So I think the stats in terms of surveys and polls that have been done with the Ukrainians show that what often holds them back from joining up is that they're afraid of not having the training, not having the ammunition, and not having the right unit. And so if you can, what they've done is they've changed the entire organization of the Ukrainian army into a core thing, and they've taken the best operating units to be the center of these cores, and then using them to train up all the other units. And so they have started to be really clever, sometime into the war, but they are doing these things that are making it a much more professional and much more effective operation. So some cool things, you might find this interesting. There's a guy called Robert Magyar, or Robert Brovdi, who's called Magyar. Magyar's birds are like the best operating drone unit, and he came from like the commercial sector or whatever, and he's got this beard, like he's really famous in Ukraine, and he started up Magyar's birds, and he started being really creative, doing loads of fundraising, getting really good kit and blowing lots of stuff up, and they were getting better and better and better, and they're like, okay, we're gonna make you now the central thing, then we're gonna create the unmanned systems forces, and then he was put in charge of it, and then we're gonna create a core around that. And anyway, the point is that it was looking at success and then celebrating success, and then how can we translate that right across the front line, but then doing creative things like, so they started up this system called Brave One, which is effectively like Amazon or eBay for equipment, and they've got a point system. So literally you get like, so if you're a drone operator, you get X amount of points for hitting a human being, for killing a human being, X amount of points for taking out a truck, X amount of points for taking out a tank, artillery piece, blah, blah, blah. And what you can do is you can change the point for, and the points win prizes, right? So the points then get translated into being able to buy stuff off Brave One, off like this eBay system, Amazon system of equipment. So then you like the best operating units get the most points, and it's like a snowball effect, and they get
Well, it's the gamification of drone warfare.
yeah.
And I was reading about that. And it's like how insightful, because people respond to incentives. And
Yes.
there's nothing better than especially if you get a bunch of young guys or young people doing drones and doing this kind of weird video game and deadly video game kind of mentality. And you incentivize the behaviors to inflict as much damage as possible to the enemy.
But so absolutely 100%, Andrew. So like we would look at any other domain in society, and you say, right, you got your KPIs, you got your key performance indicators, right? You're gonna be managed to be the most successful you can be, so you can make more money for the corporation. Whoop-de-doo, right? But what is more important than winning a freaking war where the existence of your country is at stake, right? So, like, if I'm going to want to incentivize anyone, I'm going to want to incentivize my soldiers, right? So doing this point system is like, it seems like, whoa, my God, that's horrible, gamifying war. No, that's literally the most sensible area. Like, otherwise you don't exist. You want your soldiers to be as effective and efficient as possible. And what's really interesting, so it does come with some caveats, because so what they do is they say, right, we're really at the moment suffering with Russian drones attacking us. So they've got their fiber optic drones and they got this and that. So we're going to increase the point value for drone operators, right? And so then that incentivizes the troops to go and take out drone operators. And then suddenly the Russian drone operators are on the run, and they're getting taken out left, right, and center because you've changed the incentives. But then the other problem is that many of these drone operators exist in like dugouts or buildings, and actually the incentive system works on video imagery. So if I'm like a drone operator and I'm blowing up a tank, the tank's there, I send 5 drones at it, I blow it up in different ways, immobilize it, and then drop some IEDs through, and that tank's blown up, and I give the video to my boss, and the boss gives it to there, and I get like 50 points because I've got the evidence and it's pretty obvious. Or if I send an FPV drone into someone's face, like the last thing you see is this guy's face as the FPV. I mean, it sounds horrible, but and then I get points for that person's being probably killed, but that's good enough evidence to suggest they've been hit by an FPV drone. But if you've got a drone crews operating in dugouts, then you don't know so you can send some bombs into that dugout, but you don't know if you've definitely killed those people, how many people, and blah, blah, blah. And so they've got this problem of like, of trying to evidence. So then they're like, well, we can't find the evidence. So some of these teams are like, well, we need the points. So we're going to go and blow up things that are like easy and obvious, like people walking around in fields, and they get those easy points. And actually, we're not going to attack that dugout with the drone operators because actually we can't evidence that we've killed them. So we won't definitely get the points for them. So it can cut both ways. But in general, like, this is a kind of creativity that Robert Brovdi has brought to the armed forces, and he is is that kind of innovation that you need. There's another thing called the Delta system that they're trying to sell off to NATO armed forces. It's absolutely incredible. If you go into a command center in the UK, and my mate's done this, he was out, Jonathan Fink from Silicon Curtain. He was telling me he was in this command center, and it is like a kind of one of these films you would watch and think, yeah, it's not really like that when you're watching these films. And it's like, yeah, it is. They've got all these massive screens over, and they've got the system called Delta, and it's a modular system that you can add bits onto and add-ons and this and that. And it basically allows everyone in the Ukrainian armed forces to know what everyone else is doing, and you get live feed from all the FPVs, and command centers will have live feed from every single FPV drone operating in their domain, and know that, right, we've got drones operating there, so we don't want electronic warfare interfering with our own drones, blah 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 blah. And they've got this computer system because they're so good at making apps, the Ukrainians. That's one of their like skill sets that they've long had, and their tech knowledge is amazing. And they've got this live warfare system that everyone else in the world is going to be wanting after this war. And there are a couple of silver linings to the very dark cloud of this war. They'll be able to sell defense tech, drone tech, innovations like that to the outside world, where they are the experts now.
You know, the problem about how to use these tactics and weapons, you know, with other type of tactics and weapons, you know, it's as old as warfare itself. You know, how do you use cavalry with infantry? How do you use tanks along with artillery, along with biplanes? You know, how, you know, and sooner or later someone figures out the algorithm. They figure out the recipe of how to use these different kind of forces together. And we're not at that point yet, from what you're saying.
So yeah, I mean, I'll go back before going forward. So the idea of these asymmetries that exist. So one side is using fiber optic drones, for example, and you have that advantage. And what you want to do is hammer home that advantage for as long as you possibly can, because you know the other side's going to catch up. So whatever side produces whatever new thing that is causing a mayhem for the other side, that second side will always catch up. And so in the main, in say like drone usage or the types of drones, and they're always like figuring it out, and then you're reverse engineering all this stuff. The Russians and the Ukrainians do a really good job of that, but there are these criticisms. Say the United States, the big, spending $1 trillion a year, it is still not learning enough from the war, and still not. It is interesting that Trump has now, or the Americans have now, accepted that the Ukrainians have drone expertise. So part of the buying weaponry off the US is the US buying drones off Ukraine. So there's a two-way thing that's just developed there, which is a recognition of Ukraine, what Ukraine can offer to the US. And actually, this brings me on to NATO in a second. I really want to talk about that. But but the US is still like spending stupendous amounts of money on drones that aren't very good. And rather than looking at the Ukrainians and going, well, they're making a drone. Like, we've just done fundraising. My channel's just fundraised $15,000 for a guy called Bogdan, who works in his drone labs, Capternia, and he can make a drone for $250 and get it to the 45th Assault Brigade. And here are the specs that we need. This is what we want. These are frequencies. These blah blah blah. And he's like, makes this for $250. They get it. They go and use that to drop bombs, and it's cheaper than a Mavic drone that's like $3,000, and it does exactly what you want it to do. Whereas, and the Americans and every nation should be looking at it going, we need to do that, because that's freaking cheap and freaking effective. But they're looking at it saying, yeah, no, we're going to get this company to make something, and then here's like, and this drone's going to be $150,000, and you're like, you're not learning. So there are criticisms of the Americans, particularly because obviously they're the biggest. But so what you have in the war are these what are called capability coalitions, where you have like I think there are 8 different capability coalitions. So the drone coalition is run by the Latvians and the British, but you have all these other nations as well. And what they'll be doing is working together to provide drones to Ukraine, but it's a two-way thing. Those drones will be used in Ukraine, and then they get feedback, and then like there's no such things of, I told you this before, no such things as free lunch. Everyone that's helping Ukraine is helping them for their own strategic benefit, right? Either geopolitically or militarily. So all the assistance you're giving to Ukraine, you're either getting rid of obsolete weapons, stops you decommissioning them, and blah, 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 all these different reasons. And giving drones to Ukraine means that you're getting that feedback, you're improving your drones. And then when you come to war and needing your drones to be used, they're the best freaking drones around because you've been testing them. And they've actually got this thing, Ukraine, in the last 6 months, they've actually said you can battle test any of your tech allies in Ukraine. We'll let you test your tech. So, I mean, that's what bet, like if you're a defense tech company, you're like, well, we can go to a field in Arizona and like shoot at a target, or we can send this bad boy into the Donbass and see it blow up some Russians and actually see what the problem is and learn so much more from that in a real battlefield scenario. So, you know, there's lots of ways that these capability coalitions are working for the benefit of Ukraine hugely, but also for the benefit of each nation that's operating in the capability coalitions.
Sure. Let's talk about NATO.
Yeah. So what I was going to say about NATO, all the talk in the US at the moment with Trump and peace negotiations is about security guarantees at the moment, because there is no point doing a peace negotiation and signing a deal unless there's a security guarantee. So just to explain to viewers what that means, a security guarantee is basically if the piece of paper is signed to do a peace deal, ceasefire, peace deal, blah, 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 Russia, like, we promise not to attack you again, then what's to stop Russia in 6 months' time reconstituting and attacking Ukraine again? Because that's what they've done every other time in history. So you need a guarantee that secures Ukraine from being attacked again by Russia. Now, the best guarantee in the world is NATO Article 5. No country in NATO has ever been attacked. Like, you know, apart from, you could argue, the US 9/11, but and that's when the only time that Article 5 has been invoked, and we all went and helped the US. And then the US are like, oh, what's the point of being in NATO? Hang on, we're the ones that came to help you. And then all this kind of argument you can have about that. But in terms of security guarantees, what really pisses me off about Trump is that he keeps saying, or the Americans keep saying, the Ukrainians can't join NATO. It's like, but this is the single best security guarantee. And by the way, it's the cheapest, right? If Ukraine join NATO, they bring all that expertise, right? All of that stuff that they've learned, all that technology, their most experienced army in the world in modern warfare, and they join NATO and NATO becomes better, right? But more importantly, countries don't have to send peacekeeping troops into Ukraine. So that's really expensive. So when you're talking about like coalition of the willing,
can we just stop right there? Can we just stop right there? The idea that NATO wouldn't send troops into Ukraine. I mean, there's still what, 40,000 US troops in Germany, I think, something like that. I mean, if Ukraine joins NATO, there would be US troops along with European troops, France, probably the Poles, in Ukraine.
Maybe, but there wouldn't have to be. So the point is that the security guarantee of Ukraine being in NATO is that if Russia attack again, then NATO Article 5 gets invoked. Whereas multilateral security guarantees, which is what America's demanding, because you say you can't join NATO. Okay, so we have to have something that's functionally the same as Article 5. So we're going to say we're going to put 10,000 British troops and 10,000 German troops and 10, and then we're going to have a no-fly zone here, and that's really expensive, right? For troops to be in Ukraine, like they've worked out the amount it would cost. It is serious billions of dollars for every country that's going to put troops in Ukraine. But if you said Article 5, no, you don't have to put troops in Ukraine. It's just that if Ukraine is attacked again by Russia, NATO will come and beat Russia up. Like, Russia's not attacked the Baltics because they are in NATO. Right, Finland and Sweden have joined because it is a good defensive alliance. So the cheapest way for us to provide security guarantees is a single way that Trump has said you can't do, and that's so frustrating.
And his logic for it is like, I mean, basically he's saying, well, you can't because that's what we agreed to when Ukraine or when the USSR dissolved, but like that happened with the security guarantee that the US would protect them in Budapest, right? So,
but it never happened either. So this is this myth that Gorbachev, or that in 1991 or whenever it was, that NATO promised they'd never go east of Berlin or something like that, and then Gorbachev eventually came out and said we never agreed on that. There was an agreement. but the Russian, it's part of their Russian propaganda, and then it feeds into the US, and you get some people saying, well, you can't go you can't have NATO east of Berlin. It's like, no, but that's a myth. And so it's really frustrating. And these are, NATO doesn't go around like making people join them. As soon as the Warsaw Pact finished, they all rushed to NATO and said, we want to be part of you. So this idea that NATO is expansionist and it's NATO going into other countries like Ukraine and saying, oh, we want you to be part of us. Actually, they've tried really hard for Ukraine not to be part of NATO. It's Ukraine that wants to be part of NATO. So it's understanding the reality of the situation. It's a defensive pact that people want to join voluntarily. And if they have a right to self-determination, do you know what, Russia? You don't get to tell people what they can't do. So Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia at the moment, is demanding that Russia has a veto on security guarantees. Well, what the fucking hell are you talking about, mate? Like, the security guarantees are precisely because of you imperialistic bastards. Like, you can't then decide what other people do or don't do to help Ukraine. It's just like, but then that kind of thinking gets taken on by people like JD Vance, who's like almost still appeasing Russia. Oh, it frustrates a bejesus.
Vance is like he's genuinely refuses to pick a side and say that, like, he's saying this stuff now where he's just kind of like, well, we're facilitating the discussion so they can decide on where the landlines are going to draw. And everybody's just like, you got to tell Russia that they got to give it all back. Like, that's the only reason.
And you went through this ridiculous period of people in the Trump administration not even like admitting it's a war. They're starting to use like Russian language in terms of special military operation. Then they're saying if there's a Russian missile, they would say, oh, it's really terrible that a missile blew up this place. It's like, no, it's a Russian missile. You can say it's and there's this idea that Russian can't be culpable for any of the horrors that they are clearly culpable for, because that might annoy the Russians, and we want to be appeasing them. And JD Vance is one of the worst in this. And then just recently with Kristen Welker, I think it was with Kristen Welker on NBC, he's just saying, oh, Russia are making concessions. They genuinely are making concessions. They've agreed now that they're not going to take the whole of Ukraine. It's like, that's not a fucking concession, you dimwit. Like, Russia, that's like me saying, I'm going to make a concession. I'm not going to ride to the moon on a donkey on Tuesday. I'm not going to do it now. I'm conceding that I'm not going to do that. You were never going to do that because it's physically impossible, you idiot. That is not a concession. So the Russians, the idea that JD Vance is repeating kind of Russian talking points, that they're actually conceding things, where the things they're conceding are the ridiculous things that they would never be able to achieve or get through anyway, because it's either unconstitutional for the Ukrainians to allow that or whatever.
Problem there is that's an inside the American bubble problem, where he can go on Fox and be like, so this is what's happening, and they just people these particular group of Americans who don't follow international news at all to any real extent are basically just cowed into believing it, because they're just in their head, they're like, well, there's no way that, like, even if Europe came to their defense, they couldn't beat the great and powerful Putin. And you're just like, yes, they could. Yes, they could.
So 100%, Jack. And I would say 150%, but I might sound a bit like Trump. So 100% agreement there. That is really, really on point. And what you see from... So when I was talking earlier, like, we need to understand the psychology of Trump to understand what goes on with his idea of international politics. So he's transactional. He's zero-sum game. He sees the world as a real estate mogul from New York, and everything is about screwing over the other people. Everyone's a competitor. No one's an ally. You don't have alliances, which is so he doesn't understand the EU, he doesn't understand NATO, so he doesn't see the value in the EU of NATO. The EU are competitors, so they are nasty and blah blah blah. And NATO, what's the point of us putting money into NATO? Well, actually, I could tell you why it's advantageous for you to be you're not. And by the way, you're not putting money into NATO, you are spending money on your own defenses. So he thinks NATO, and I'm sure we talked about this before, so he says they owe us all this money because because they're not spending enough percentage of their GDP on defense, as if like NATO expenditure is a pizza, and like we pay more for you than you, so like we should either have more of the pizza, or no, you're not paying for a thing, you're paying for your own defense, so that if Article 5 is invoked, everyone is prepared enough because they spent enough on their defense to then bring their forces to bear. Now if Spain hasn't been paying enough, it's not like they don't owe America. Like, so his understanding, like he talks in terms of like they owe us money because they haven't paid enough. No, they're just unprepared, and actually they should be. That's not good for NATO, and they do need to spend more money, but it's not. They don't owe America that money. Do you know what I mean? Like, so it's understanding. He doesn't understand NATO. He doesn't understand alliances, and
Yeah,
he.
yeah, yeah. You know, and oh my God, oh my fictitious God, I don't want to feel like I am defending Trump. But if there was a way to communicate displeasure to the Spanish, because you're right, they're not even coming, well, they're not getting close to their share, from what I understand. If there was a way to communicate displeasure, the most simple, guttural, visceral way of saying it is that you owe us money.
Well, I would defend Trump in saying he does achieve some things by outright bullying, but the problem is like then people just think he's a horrible bully, and so like the way he's doing economics at the moment is by bullying and by putting tariffs on people, and even with Intel, it's like the hypocrisy in the American government is outstanding. Or in GOP is outstanding, isn't it? It's like, oh, you bloody communists, or you communists, oh, Kamala Harris is a socialist, again, blah blah blah. Oh, we're going to force Intel to sell 10% of their stakes to the US government. Oh, we're going to go around doing that. And what's his name, Hassett today has said that he's going to do that with more companies. Like, that's socialism. I don't have a problem with that, by the way, in the US having like strategic fingers in pies, but it's just that's exactly what you would denigrate the Democrats for previously.
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, at that point, like, it's weird that you have this situation where you've got this giant company, and okay, they're basically just going to tithe to the country for whatever reason, and as opposed to just having Congress make that a tax that gets the same amount of money from that same company. Like, why do it this way and make it look like the company is, you know?
So I think it comes down to like this idea of bullying, and also power and being at the center of everything. So going back to the whole like understanding of Trump's psychology, like he just wants to be at the center of attention. He needs that validation. He's such a narcissist. So the latest South Park episode is brilliant yet again, in a way that it showed all these people lining up with gold and gifts to give to Trump, and then they sit down and say, "Here's your gold, and by the way, you definitely don't have a small penis." And it's just absolutely brilliant on so many levels. But Trump is this. I mean, he's covered the White House in gold, and it's just horrific. And then everyone knows this now. This is how manipulatable he is, because he's so desperate for validation and so desperate for being told how wonderful he is. You just go and tell him how wonderful he is, and then Tim Cook walks in with a nugget of gold and gives him that, and he walks out with tariff exemptions. You've got African leaders saying you can build a golf course in my country, and he's like, yeah, awesome. They know, everyone now knows, if you go to Trump and offer him a quid pro quo gift, that you will get what you need. So then imagine if you're a former KGB dictator, how easy it is to manipulate him. He goes in the Alaska summit and says, "Oh, by the way, the election was stolen. It was rigged. Mail-in ballots suck. You were cheated there. You're wonderful. You definitely don't have a small penis." And blah 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 blah. And Putin says this to Trump, and Trump comes out being manipulated, and it's just so easy.
You know, in Putin, now we're gonna talk about Putin and Putin's defense is the fact that, you know, a lot of American presidents have been really stupefied. And okay, so I'm thinking about Bush the younger, I guess, looking into the soul of Putin, um, and just being conned by the man.
Well, I mean, that's just Putin's craft, right? But like,
Yeah.
I think there's part of that is actually like, because you've talked about how now he's surrounded by, you know, this cadre of people with a real agenda. And I think part of that is them just, well, you know, we know Trump, we know what Trump's good at, we know what there's the stuff that we want to put him on TV about, and the stuff that we want to give him to keep him distracted while we write up this policy and do this stuff. right? So, like, I think giving him stuff to do, like redecorate, is kind of a way to keep him busy so he doesn't go out and say anything stupid.
Yeah, because what's really interesting when he does go out. So, oh, there's so much to talk about here. So, like, what happens is Trump, because Trump doesn't have the requisite knowledge,
Mhm.
he can't kind of real time fact check what people tell him because he doesn't really know. So he has this recency bias where he just regurgitates what the last person said to him. And because he spends a lot of time in Mar-a-Lago or at the White House, he just regurgitates what essentially Heritage Foundation tell him, or the peeps, right? His peeps around him tell him. And so that is deeply ideological and deeply wrong and highly problematic. But when he goes out to the Basilica in the Vatican for the Pope's funeral and meets with Zelensky on his own, when he goes to the NATO summit, and he came back from the NATO summit saying these leaders really love their countries and they're really trying to do the best for both Ukraine and their countries. Like, yeah, that's what other leaders do. Like, they give a shit about their country and they're actually operating on behalf of their electorate to make their countries better, you dimwit, but you're just there to grift. So he goes and he has these like moments where he's like, oh, this is what politics is actually supposed to be like. And this is what alliances look like. And then he has these moments of kind of greater clarity. And that's where he's nicer to Ukraine. And he goes out and has these meetings, or when lots of European leaders come to the White House, and all of those people are telling Trump the reality and they're showing stuff on a map because he doesn't take intelligence briefings. So the best intelligence briefings he ever gets is when other people come to the White House and tell him what's actually going on. And so he goes to these places, or they come to him, and then he has these moments of clarity, and then they all go, or he comes back to the White House, and then within a week he's like defaulting back to Putin appeasement because that's his default position and it appeals to his kind of narcissism, the sense of power, and he doesn't have these people around him actually telling him the truth about really what's going on. And so, you know, that fundamental lack of knowledge that he has explains so much of how he operates. And also, and I'll add a very important component here. So someone that's really worth listening to an awful lot is Fiona Hill. So Fiona Hill was a National Security Council member in Trump 1.0, and then she ended up being called to the impeachment, wasn't she, or to the Mueller inquiry or whatever, and then obviously got on the wrong side of Trump. And that was that. But she has been on the phone with Trump and Putin, and her analysis of what went on is fascinating. She said Trump would be fundamentally unprepared. So he'd have these phone calls with Putin, and she like, I'm translating her words. She said basically he would just be relying on vibes, and he'd be like, right, I've got a winning personality. I've got this. Basically, he's got this fallacy of invincibility because no one tells him when he's wrong, right? And also he controls the press now. So, you know, in the White House, the press call's been changed. You've got right-wing influencers in these chairs. He now has certain press gaggles where there are no mainstream media. So no one's asking him difficult questions. And when someone does ask him a difficult question, he says, who are you with? And they go, ABC News. He says, you guys are terrible. I'm not answering that question. And so he deflects from ever having to answer a difficult question, which builds into this sense of invincibility that he's always right. And then he wears a cap that says, I'm always right. And so imagine that that's who you are. So you've got to understand Trump's psychology to say, right, he's then going to go and have a phone call with Putin. He was in the middle of a meeting with the European leaders, and he just stood up and said, right, I'm going to phone Putin now, because he's like, well, I can vibe winning this conversation and get Putin to do what he wants. Putin's a bit better than that and can manipulate Trump, but Trump doesn't realize he's being manipulated. So Fiona Hill was saying he'll be deeply unprepared on the phone calls. He didn't realize that Putin was taking the piss out of him. So Putin would say things that the translator, because she can speak Russian, she would know what Putin was actually saying, and then translator would kind of smooth it out so Trump wouldn't really realize. But Putin was just manipulating and taking a piss, was obviously much more prepared, and Trump was just trying to go on vibes and is deeply unprepared. And that is Trump. He's just like waltzes through the world thinking I can just win every engagement with my personality and my strength and my bravado.
So right now, I mean, if Putin's game is just to keep the status quo and keep basically fighting in Ukraine, outside of a collapse on the Western alliance for Ukraine, or outside of Putin dying or his regime crumbling, how does this end?
The best hope for Ukraine, and I've said this for a very long time, and it looks more and more plausible at the moment, is a collapse in the Russian economy. So there are loads of canaries in the coal mine at the moment that are signaling that the Russia's economy is in all sorts of trouble. Added to that, Ukraine has just been battering the crap out of a bunch of oil refineries, oil depots, and liquefied natural gas compressing, hydrocracking units and whatever. And something like 14% of their capacity has just been knocked out. And that's where they make their money. Russians are like the Kuril Islands on the eastern side of the Russian seaboard. These set of islands that really the Japanese own. You can't get petrol there now, and they've got petrol prices are spiked in what is the gas station nation, right? That you've got queues to petrol stations all over the shop, and that is a canary in a coal mine. You've got agricultural crop yields in trouble, and you've got profits going down because of machinery. They can't get out of machinery, inflation in machinery. Sanctions, you've got civil aviation industry absolutely tanking. Not only have you got delays in all the airports every time that the Ukrainians send drones up, they love that. They shut down, it's called the carpet plan, where the Russians will shut down their airports. And then, of course, that has knock-on effect economically. You've got the loading on Russian trains. It's a train nation. They're loading, it's absolutely tanked, and that is a reflection of the economy. If you're not loading stuff on trains, you're not moving stuff around, you're not buying and selling stuff. That is a canary in a coal mine. You've got, goodness no, you've got the car manufacturers and truck manufacturers are going down to 4-day working week, which is, they're not doing that for the benefit of their workers. It's because no one's buying cars and trucks, and they're screwed, and so on and so forth. I could keep going on and on and on. People are withdrawing money from the banks. You put all of these pieces of jigsaw together. Now, people have been saying for a long time, oh, the Russian economy, it's going to crumble, and never really does. But actually, they have chomped through an awful lot of their reserves, their foreign currency reserves, their gold reserves, and they are in a lot of economic trouble, and they can't rely on the war economy and buying and creating tanks, because actually they're not creating enough of them. They're kind of maxed out their military industrial complex, and it's not enough to keep the GDP artificially inflated. So the economy crumbles. They can't fund the war. Then the morale, people aren't getting paid. You already got like Novoshakhtinsk's refinery that was hit like this week and was burning for 5 days. Huge refinery. They haven't been paid in 4 months, those workers, right? So, you start getting that in the armed forces, you're going to get morale issues. That's the economy crumbles. That is what the military success of Ukraine is contingent upon. So for me, and this could have, like, Trump's so dumb, right? This is super important to understand, right? If Trump had gone hard against Russia, he would have kept the Reagan Republicans. The MAGA Republicans would have just followed him anyway, because they don't really give a shit. And only people like Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene would have had an issue with it, whatever. If he had actually gone hard on Russia and supporting Ukraine on January the 21st, he would have been way better in the polls right now. He could have sanctioned the crap out of Russia, and Russia would be economically absolutely crippled now, and Ukraine could have the platform to therefore militarily succeed. Trump made the wrong decision. But going back to what you guys were saying just now, like with George Bush, like thought he could. So every American president since goodness knows when, Reagan, thought they could reset with Russia. Reset. Hillary Clinton, Obama, Bush, Biden, reset. And every time they found out they can't, because Russia is Russia and Putin is Putin. But actually, Trump thought he could do that in his own inimitable way. And now it appears that he's finding out that he can't reset with Russia, that actually they are just going to frustrate you time and time again. How long is Trump willing to keep trying to give them 2 weeks before he finds out he is too weak? That's where we're at the moment.
Well played. Very nice.
And so the economy, I think, is the key. Is the absolute key. Sanctions, the US could absolutely destroy Russia if they really wanted to. The US could sanction the crap. The EU is still doing this. The 19th package of sanctions is due to be implemented fairly soon, or to be revealed fairly soon. It's a 19th package of sanctions. The US hasn't put any extra sanctions on since January 2020. 5, sorry, since January this year. Like, it's so frustrating. Trump has all the cards to be able to bring Putin to his knees, and Trump would go down in history properly as being like responsible for the destruction of the Russian Empire. Right, he could have all the plaudits. Like, I'd give him the Nobel Peace Prize if he actually did the right thing. Like, you know, I wouldn't really want to do that, but look, do you know what? I'd bribe you with a Nobel Peace Prize if he actually did the right thing for Ukraine, and you could go down in history as having done the right thing. But he just won't do it because the people around him are Heritage Foundation. So the Heritage Foundation is part funded by money from Russia. So I wrote a massive article, a feature article for Only Sky some years ago, a couple of years ago during the war, because Tucker Carlson, why does he keep interviewing Viktor Orban? Why is he in love with Viktor Orban? Why is the CPAC in love with Viktor Orban? Why is the Conservatives, why do they love Viktor Orban? Well, it turns out that Tucker Carlson's father is a board member of the lobbying company that lobbies for Viktor Orban, right? So that's the Tucker Carlson connection. Then it turns out that the Heritage Foundation gets some money from I don't know how much they get, but they do get some money from the Bethany Foundation and the Danube Institute. Both of these are Hungarian organizations that one of them gets money from the propaganda arm of the Hungarian government. And then the Hungarian government get money from Russia. So you can build a case that Russia indirectly is putting money into the Heritage Foundation. So then you start understanding why the Heritage Foundation at the beginning of the war flipped. So they were pro-Ukraine until about a few months into the war, and they weirdly suddenly flipped. And then the Heritage Foundation is the Trump administration. So when you start seeing, like, if you're going to look for compromise within the Trump administration, you can talk about compromise with Trump going back to 1987 and all sorts going on there. And I could detail a load of weird things in Trump's history. But with the Heritage Foundation and they being responsible for the people around him feeding all this stuff, why did the Americans keep fighting against supporting Ukraine? I put it down to the compromise of the Heritage Foundation and CPAC and all that.
This is a great place to stop because I'm going to turn into a pumpkin. Jonathan MS Pearce, where can people find you, sir?
Well, if you're the FSB, I'm somewhere like Timbuktu or maybe still on holiday somewhere. But if you are decent human beings, you can find me at I've got a website that's now being resurrected, A Tippling Philosopher, where all my writing from Only Sky has been put back up. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on YouTube, ATP Geopolitics. Look, it's on my t-shirt. And I would love you guys to hang out there because it's a wonderful community and this is the kind of stuff I talk about all day. And I'm just really, I apologize because I did this to you guys last time, but I spoke way too much and I did it again today. Sorry.
You answered the questions.
Never a problem on this show.
Yeah, you're fine. Hey, everyone, thanks for watching. Jack Matirko, any last thoughts?
Man, it would be really good if, like, Sylvester Stallone would kind of be like, you know, my mom's family's from Odessa. Maybe I should take a side in this and reconsider that Kennedy Center trophy. Oh, no. I think it would.
But oh god, there's so much. There's another half an hour to talk about, but of course I can't. But you talk about key people in the GOP to have on your side. So there's a guy called Pastor Mark Burns. So he is one of Trump's spiritual advisors, but he was anti-Ukraine, then went to Ukraine and had a road to Damascus moment, is now totally pro-Ukraine. There's a guy called Keith Kellogg, who's the envoy to Ukraine. Ukraine just took both those people over and gave him a medal. So clever. Here's a medal for your awesomeness. Now go back to the United States and shout about how wonderful Ukraine is. In the same way that Sylvester Stallone should, but then Sylvester Stallone is deep in MAGA world now, so you can't expect that from him.
Gentlemen, I'm going to run because I have to go to work. I have a day job.
He's got a heart out. So we'll say goodbye in a sec.
All right, I'll see you guys later. Good seeing you,
Take care,
John.
Andrew.
Yep.
And you, man.
So let's stop depending on some happy ending, shouting the slogans righteous and